Welcome to the 3Haunted podcast, where we bring you all things horror, supernatural, folklore, mythology, and all things that go bump in the night.
Hey guys, this is your co-host Ashley, Gorilla Girl filmmaker, lunar goddess, and cinephile.
And I'm your co-host John Thomas, ghost hunter, super smartass, and film lover extraordinaire.
What's up, ghouls, gals, and cornfield stalking metapals? In today's episode, we'll be discussing the intriguing phenomenon of crop circles, and then heading on over to Utah to discuss Skinwalker Ranch. Is the ranch cursed? Do aliens frequently visit there? Who or what is mutilating the cows at the ranch? Is the government involved? Join us as we dip into some of the mysteries of Skinwalker Ranch. We also have two guests joining us today. Who? Stay tuned and find out.
But first, a word from our network sponsor.
Are you looking for more awesome podcasts? Head on over to withoutyourhead.com for access to the Without Your Head podcast network, where you'll find a variety of podcasts sure to keep you entertained and coming back for more.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Like Ashley said, we have two returning guests. Or she said special guests. She didn't say returning. But we have two returning guests. One of them from good old season 1, Mr. David Gunn. How you doing tonight?
Thank you very much. And thank you again for inviting me back.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Always fun to have you.
Yeah, you're like our creative crazy. We love you. Welcome back.
And we've got somebody you've heard from the last couple episodes at least, Mr. Shane. Good to have you back again as well.
Thank you. The tenacious titty lover is here.
Oh my God. Well, I guess that's how you start a show.
Yes. Love it.
I mean, David Gunn has a name that assumes that he's packing. So, I mean...
Packing what?
David Gunn, come on.
What are you packing, David? What kind of gun are you packing?
That's the question of the podcast, ladies and gentlemen.
I'll just refer to Paul Stanley. So.
Oh, man. No one can beat his chest here, though.
Well, this is an exciting start to our show. I know this is going to be a hell of a next 60 minutes or so. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yes.
So, crop circles, Skinwalker Ranch. Let's start with crop circles because that's just like, holy moly. I was looking up crop circles on the internet, and some of the designs out there are insane, like how intricate they are.
Yes.
I know. I just recently saw Trump 2024.
Well,
It was weird.
There you go.
So are Russians behind it? Maybe.
Well, there's actually, there's a group out there online, Circle Makers. I think it's .org. And you can actually pay them, like commission them to do crop circles in your crops.
Oh, yeah.
And they'll fly out and do
They
it.
have that big thing that mashes the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
big wooden
the thing.
board attached to their feet with like the rope.
big wood. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, like their designs are pretty intricate.
And of course, you know, because they're out there doing it, and now everyone thinks they're fake because they think those are the guys behind it.
Yeah, everyone's lumped in.
Well, since I'm going to date myself.
Oh, master dater, David.
And I'm probably older than any in the room. What was your first encounter with the concept of crop circles? Like, when did you become aware of them in your life?
I don't even know.
So would you say it was probably from popular culture, or do you think it was from, like, you actually reading up on the subject?
Probably a little both.
Yeah. I think it would happen to have probably been both just
Okay.
because as a kid I was super into like sci-fi and that kind of stuff. So I would probably, I'd be willing to bet though my dad watched a lot of like conspiracy theory shows growing up and like programs. And I know I watched a lot of those just with him, and it's a good chance I saw crop circles on there and then kind of branched out into, ooh, what's that? Where's that come from? What does that mean?
Right. Like, I think there was probably like an episode of Unsolved Mysteries or something that I might have seen something about it when I was younger. But yeah.
What about you?
Well, for me, since I'm probably older, my first encounter with crop circles is probably going back to stuff like In Search Of and things like that. But again, the topic of crop circles back then was kind of, it was pretty serious. Now I know years later it was revealed, like the two guys in England who were committing the fake crop circles and stuff like that. But at the time when it first came to my attention as a kid, they would talk about things like that there was a historical record for these kinds of deformations in crop fields or agriculture in various points in history. I would say for me though, for crop circles, because I know we're going to go to the second subject. Crop circles for me kind of lost the allure, not because obviously people were faking them, but because it did become such a catch-all for like popular culture and stuff like that. So, when you talk about like the intricate geometric patterns, those are cool. Those are actually works of art. But I want to say there was a video that was put out like maybe something like 7 or 8 years ago that was trying to talk about crop circles as a daytime phenomenon versus a nighttime phenomenon. And the video was interesting because it showed, I forget where the location was, but it showed a light, if you want to call it an orb of light or something like that, that had flown into the location of this kind of pasture. And the light was doing just kind of a movement, like a gliding back and forth, and then it had left. Now, I don't know what the context was of the footage, how far it was away. I mean, they were a good distance away, but it was someone who was capturing this. And then sometime later, it turns out that that location, that field or pasture, because like I said, I don't know if it was a specific crop, it did have a technical crop circle in it. And so I'm always more interested in the things that happen in the daytime, something like that, as opposed to, because they talk about like in England that like a lot of the crop circle locations are places that are pretty close to areas that you could pretty much walk off a trail or walk off a road and get to. So then therefore it's easy to fake it or to hoax it. But it's the ones that are in kind of either that aren't happening at nighttime, that they happen during the daytime, or the ones that happen to be in a location that would be, kind of difficult to get to, or would just be outright trespassing, where you would have to violate, someone's security system in order to get onto the property and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think too, to your point, I really like also the ones that have like potentially like natural phenomenon to explain them. So for example, there are the fairy circles, which are basically like the mushrooms grown in a circle, right? But they were saying that can also create disturbances in the fields and create circles by the fairy rings kind of growing up and destroying the plant life in the areas. But also I thought a really interesting one was that people were finding some of the crop circles pop up in places close to archaeological sites. And so the idea that maybe there's stuff underneath the surface that is disturbing the vegetation up top that potentially kills it off and creates these patterns. Although other people, argue that, especially the ones close to Stonehenge, that people are kind of capitalizing off of it's close to a very well-known archaeological site and creating the circles near there to kind of bring in that tourism. So lots of different really neat ideas out there.
To touch on that, I mean, think of what all these archaeological sites used to serve as when the people who created them were still around. They were there for, take the Nazca ruins or the Nazca lines. They're there for astrological purposes, for, telling seasons and all that. And really you could go as far as say, okay, well, if these crop circles are appearing there, who knows? Maybe they are still being used to communicate, and whatever was communicating with them way back when are still trying to reach out. Kind of reminds me like that. I don't know if you guys ever seen Star Trek, where the movie where what is it? A satellite comes back and it's trying to communicate. It's basically destroying Earth, but it's trying to communicate with Earth or with the whales, and the whales are all extinct,
Right.
So they have to go back in time, right? So like, maybe there's these aliens that are still around, or they're still like, hey, hoping that the same people that they had communication with all that time ago are still around, and like, hey, we're still trying to give you a sign here. Who knows?
Well, the thing I would add to that too is like, in a lot of those sites where there was like credible research being done, they would look for things like if there was any kind of radiation within the particular area, or if there was something going on with the actual Earth, something that was emanating from the ground, because I know a lot of people wanted to say that crop circles were, it was just a flying saucer that landed and smash the grass. And for a lot of people, it was like, well, no, that's not what our experience was. We didn't see a quote unquote flying saucer. We did see what we thought were lights, but they weren't like the size of an airplane or anything like that. They, like what Ashley said, like fairies, something that seems small enough yet large enough to catch your eye, and yet behaving in a way that seemed kind of weird. You didn't think anything of it. And then when someone came back to the property, it was like, oh, whoa, what's this deformation in the ground?
Yeah, and I mean, think about it. It's as a human that's before technology exists. You're not going to notice a whole lot of carvings in the ground, so to speak, or movement of dirt as much as you would notice something happening in your crops, which you rely on for sustenance, or a field, which you rely on for other reasons. I think that the primitive man, that was the best way to get a hold of him, or get, hey, let's talk to him. Now so much, I think it's we notice it because now we have access to helicopters and planes and all that. The Nazca lines just still make me wonder, like, okay, if the Nazca lines still are there, and they would never have been able to see them from, unless you were in a plane, way above in the sky, and so, okay, yeah, that's a man, or that's a bird. It makes me wonder, like, okay, well, then the crop circles, there has to be something else to the crop circles then.
Well, there are stories like going back to the 1600s. Like everybody goes back to the brothers that did the hoax of like the flying saucer nest, right? Like in what was that, the 60s, 70s, 1970s? But there's literature.
You're talking about the 1678 pamphlet, right? The Mowing Devil.
Yes, it's describing a crop circle. And there's other stories out there, folklore of like describing crop circles, farmers describing what they're finding of patterns within their fields. And it's like, okay, they were talking about it, but to Shane's point, it's like we didn't have overhead cameras to spot these as much. We didn't have drones and just cameras in general to go back certain times. So just the fact that it was described in literature, what we're seeing in photos from the 1970s on, I think that there's something more than it's a hoax because these two brothers did it. Like they were inspired by something. And there is literature that dates back to it in pamphlets. And not only that, but think about this. So I like to use facts and figures because why not? Science. So in the 20th century, there were reported at least 10,000 crop circles. So there have been some scientists out there that say 80% of those can be attributed to a hoax. So it's 20% they can't figure out. That's 2,000. 2,000 crop circles, at least, that we don't know. That's a big amount, right? That's a lot of crop circles that it's like, well, I don't know how it happened. Because it's not like people are out there smashing. When they describe what's being found, some of them are flattened. And those you could tell, okay, people did that. But some of them, the stalks are actually bent. They're bent down enough to be able to create a visual, but they're not broken. It's like someone's smashing it with wood. Right. So it's like, okay, what's causing that? I want to know what's causing those. Like David said, like, okay, we know the hoaxes. I don't care about those. But what's causing the ones that everyone's like, I don't know.
And a number of those ones that are the ones that fall into the category of not being explained are a lot of the daytime ones, where it's like, you did have, whether it's CCTV or other monitoring type stuff, where people have gone back and like looked at these locations that were daytime events. And it's like, well, we didn't see a van pull up. We didn't see a bunch of people trekking in with a bunch of equipment to come and do this. And so there is no real like physical identification of someone coming in and trying to perpetrate a hoax. So then it does go back to, it's like, okay, well, it's daytime. We can't see anyone. So what gives? And then you've seen those guys who come in and are like, well, it could have been a micro tornado that landed and it did a little whirl.
Which literally the likelihood of that happening is way less likely than a UFO coming in overhead and saying, oh, I'm going to do the symbol and flying off.
Exactly. Yeah. I am curious if any of you know this or not. I thought there was a study that was being done years ago by some outfit that was going to, because you were brought up earlier about the geometric patterns, and that they were doing a study to try to figure out if there was some kind of actual legitimate mathematical code that was embedded in the geometric configurations that were being displayed in the more current day crop circles. But I didn't pay that much attention to it at the time, other than just seeing it come up as an article headline. And so I don't know what the outcome of that was.
Yeah, I don't know. I know what you're talking about because they were finding like this more and more of the sacred geometry popping up in the crop circles and trying to figure out, is it a message? What is it, or is it just pretty designs? But I don't know what came of
Didn't they
that.
just declassify a lot of that stuff?
I don't know.
Because I just watched something because I guess well they just did or passed a bill earlier this year or sometime last year where they basically have to declassify any UFO files. So a lot of the stuff that they were reporting, a lot of the UFO sightings, crop circles, abductions. All that weather balloon crap that they had back in the what was it, the 60s, it was all bogus. There was no weather balloon. The doctor that they had in charge of basically to debunk the whole program and basically say, hey, it's all fake. There's nothing to it. There's no life. Started to think himself, who's hired by the CIA to specifically say there was no aliens. And then he goes, hey, I think there's something to this. I think this is worthy of investigating, and starts investigating and starts really like looking into it a little bit. Eyewitness sightings, and okay, there has to be something to it because there's just too much coincidence going on.
Because they focus on disproving it and debunking it so much, we're not seeing the patterns that spreads. Like, it's not just unique to crops. So the sacred geometry, the different types of geometrical patterns that may or may not lend to like mathematical coding, that's not found just in crop circles. That's found in sand, snow, ice. That's even trickier, right? Because how do you create a snow geometrical figure like that without leaving some kind of like trek away print? And sand, same thing. Those are very like sensitive types of material to be working with, but those get found in those kind of areas as well, landscape terrain. So maybe there is something to that. I know that there is something to the crop circles that are not man-made, where the stalks are bent. What that is, I don't know. A lot of scientists say, okay, it's magnets. It's some kind of like electromagnetic or wind, many dirt devil, what did they call the one in Australia? Like a willy-nilly or something. I don't even know what it was called. It's like a mini tornado that like comes down just the right time to create these little circles. And I'm like, I don't know about that. Like, that's reaching, which I find ironic. I think that's funny. It's like, you guys are reaching that it's aliens. And I'm like, you're reaching that this mini little tornado came down and touched down in 5 different spots to create this perfect spiral of circles. That's odd. I think we're all like trying to find the thing that doesn't scare us most.
Yeah, I think you're onto something right there. I really think people are so much into reaching for the comfortable that we're so willing to dismiss. I mean, World War II. I mean, we're so willing to dismiss. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. It's nothing. I'm gonna go about my normal life and continue my normal life. When really, like the minds that are like, no, there's got to be something else out there. We're not really afraid to go into the deep and the dark and go, okay, I got to see this for myself because I know there's something there. They go with that feeling. We don't care about the comfortable.
I would add that I'm a firm believer in the pursuit of, in any of this stuff when you're looking at mathematics. Shane brought up earlier, he was talking about the Nazca lines. So, I've heard like 2 schools of thought about the Nazca lines, but each one of them is kind of hard to wrap your head around, because one implies that they at that time were able to create inflatable dirigibles and able to elevate themselves so that they could look down on the ground that they were doing to map that out. And then others were saying, well, no, they didn't have that technology. They relied on mathematics. But the mathematics to lay out something like the Nazca lines would then imply then that you're a pretty advanced society. So where's the rest of it? So going back to the crop circles, looking for math in the crop circles, because scientists have always said that if there was going to be a universal language throughout the universe, it would be some form of mathematics or mathematical understanding. Yeah. So if you could find something like that did not blatantly look like it was of terrestrial origin in a crop circle, I'm all for pursuing, that kind of analysis of it. But you're right, crop circles for me, that's what I was getting at earlier about, like, because you talk about crop circles and then my friends will be like, oh, well, I love the movie Signs. And it's like, okay, well, that's not really what I'm talking about with crop circles, it's become such an attachment point to popular culture that, anyone who was doing any kind of serious investigation of it, it gets muted.
Oh, you're just another crazy. Yeah.
Another crazy creative.
You know?
Did you guys ever see, there's like a video, and I'll show it to you really quickly, actually, because I think I could share it.
Signs?
No. But it's actually pretty neat. And, you know, it could be animation. I mean, David, you know your visual effects, but it's actually interesting to watch. So this is supposedly a crop circle in Scotland. I don't know how well you guys can see that, but it's interesting to see those light orbs. And if you watch the ground beneath it, like that was fast as these little light orbs are like circulating around. Now, that's not to say aliens or fairies,
Right.
but it's aliens and fairies. No, I'm just kidding. It makes me wonder, you know, we don't know what technology is out there. And so, like, we know what we have general access to, but we don't know what necessarily is out there. So is it possible that that's some kind of technology right now that's able to do that from up above, create these kind of impressions into the earth?
Cell phone technology evolved in such a way in 10 years that we can't even wrap our head around. And imagine what has evolved over millions and millions of years out there.
Yeah.
You know, so now I bet those are drones literally just sent here by another drone just to communicate and be like, hey, we're waiting for a response of any intelligent life. And then they go, yep, never mind, we're going back to the ship. And then they leave, and then they're going to come back in another 2 years or 3 years and then do the same thing, hoping for a response.
Yeah, because watching that video, in my mind, those did look like something that would be drone-like. And even the way in the flight pattern of it, you know, it moved in a circle. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like erratic moving back and forth. It did move in a circle over the crops as they kind of, it almost looked like wind kind of blowing it apart. If you notice, the circles kind of spread from the center and out.
Reminds me of the spray painting machine on Demolition Man. You know, where it spray paints the wall really quick and it's done.
Yeah, and that was like interesting to watch, because to me, I didn't automatically assume like that's fairies. I was like, yeah, that's some technology that created that very quickly. Whether it's our technology or not, I don't know. But that definitely looked machine doing something.
I was going to say, do you know what year that video was?
I don't. Let me see if I can find it while you guys continue the conversation.
Something funny that I found, I don't know how true this is, but I just have to bring it up because it wouldn't be our podcast if something funny didn't come up. But I was reading about how a bunch of crop circle enthusiasts in the 80s came up with their explanation for it was the sexual activity of horny hedgehogs.
Sounds like a heavy metal band.
Right.
So that almost sounds like the other one, which is that people who were doing the crop circles claimed that they were being possessed by alien beings, and so they were acting through them to communicate.
Yes, there we go.
I prefer the horny hedgehog theory.
Anything that has anything to do with possession, Ashley's just like, nah, we're good.
I don't know. The horny hedgehog theory sounds kind of like a sharp concept.
Ha ha ha. Ouch.
I'm so funny. So David, that video was from supposedly 1996, but it was posted to YouTube 2014. But it says it was in Scotland.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, again, because, like, just in all fairness, it's like, you know, I don't know if the video is legitimate or not.
Right.
So, you know, but it would be interesting to track down the elements of that video, find out where that source video first originally came from, and find out if there's been anything added to it, or if that is purely what it was done in 1996. Because even if the video wasn't real, there are accounts of daytime crop circles that have happened, that have been supported by the fact that there were further evidence of interviews of people who either owned the property or had properties proximitating to the property, where there was, you know, clear view observation, and where they could not track down any kind of evidence of someone coming into a location and making this kind of event happen, which then is kind of like, okay, so how did it happen? So even if the video wasn't real, or if it is real, there are still accounts that basically, you know, like you talked about, the ones that slip through the cracks, the ones that you can't say, okay, yeah, it was a bunch of teenagers drunk one night, you know, or it was the two brothers, or whoever, or if it was a corporate advertising gig that they were going to do because they wanted to sell some new kind of shoe. So the ones that have this weird event that surrounds them, those are the ones that I'm most fascinated with.
Crop circle Converse. I would dig it.
I'd buy it.
Yeah.
Trying to track down anything hits wise on this video. It's the same video, but I don't see anything prior to it being uploaded prior to 2014. Okay. That's not to say that means anything. Someone could have gotten a hold of footage and that's when it came online, but I am not finding too many hits on that.
And again, the other thing too is like, I don't know how familiar people are, but throughout the years there have been investigative journalists like Linda Moulton Howe, who has done research on crop circles. And even going back to the 1990s, there were programs, and I'm not talking about kind of the cheesy stuff we have today, but there were older TV programs that were examining the phenomenon, and they were examining it in a serious way.
I did find one other theory that I thought was interesting, and it had to do with magnetism when it comes to crop circles. So one guy postulated that our magnetic poles, they kind of shift over time. I think it was like 3 degrees every year or something like that. But there is like a magnetic shift on Earth. And he was saying that somehow attributed to crop circles. Now, I didn't quite think that aligned as well, because if it's that slow rate of a magnetic movement, I don't see a whole geometric thing surfacing overnight with a slow magnetic movement. But there was a scientist who found that using equipment from a microwave and a 12-volt battery, he could get the crops to bend, as you see in the crop circles. So he was able to actually mimic the bending that you see versus the breaking of the stalks using a microwave, pieces of a microwave tubing and a 12-volt battery. So I found that kind of interesting. That's not to say people are walking out with that, but the fact that something in that combination, that electromagnetic kind of force is doing that, maybe leads us towards something out there that's creating these ones we can't identify, is carrying enough electromagnetic force to create these like really intricate designs. Alien technology.
Well, I mean, and then that opens up the whole box again, which is like, is it really alien technology? Because if you keep following that rabbit hole, you hear everything from it's our future communicating with us, trying to warn us about our own future. Is it aliens technology? Is it aliens who exist on our world but exist in a different dimension? So they're trying to come here to communicate to us, to warn us about, certain things. Because the whole thing is like, so what is the purpose of a crop circle? If you're some being or some entity and you're showing up, what are you trying to communicate by plopping down here and making this deformation? Because that's the argument I always heard from people, where it's like, well, if you were an alien and you really wanted to communicate something, wouldn't you do something else in a much grander scale than just plop down in someone's yard?
No, I really think they're trying to get a hold of the right people. They're and really the mass is not ready for it yet. I think that they want people to figure it out and discover, and then when everyone's kind of ready to share in that knowledge, then we're ready to communicate.
Well, we always say math is the universal language, right? No matter what languages are out there, math is like the language that makes sense to everybody and at the foundation of how the world works and science works. And so if we're talking about a lot of these sophisticated crop circles with the sacred geometric shapes to them, sacred geometry is math at its base. So maybe it's just an attempt to communicate in a language that is something we can receive if we actually put an honest effort into that. It may not be something we understand yet because people kind of lump sacred geometry and mathematical, components of that to the more metaphysical side of the house, even though abstract math, creating shapes, is a very real, study in college under the math discipline. So creating spirals and other types of shapes using mathematical equations. So I think if people just applied a little bit more of that to break it down, we may be able to decipher what's being communicated through these. And it may be nothing. It may be a person creating pretty shapes. But at the end of the day, looking at some of these very advanced ones, it's like someone had to have. That's not someone getting drunk and putting wood on their feet one night. That's some serious planning and mathematical equation plotting and execution. Like that is some highly sophisticated implementation. So if nothing else, if that is a human, get that Rain Man on and bring him to a university to figure out how their brain works, because that is super sophisticated.
What if it's just like a bunch of international, like little brats, like the youth of the aliens like to hang out at planet Earth and just tag up the whole planet.
Hooligans.
Like that's their pastime. Yeah, and little bastards.
Hooligans of the universe. That's a concept.
Yeah.
As a guy who was a carpenter, it requires quite a bit of teamwork to put something together on a large scale. So for those ones, the crop circles that are like really specifically down to the inch geometrically designed, that's a lot of coordination and that's a lot of teamwork. So just for humans to go out one night and plot that and map it and do it in a consistent way without there being a bunch of fuck ups, that's a pretty hard chore right there.
Yes.
So it kind of was almost proof that there's higher intellect behind it, because you look at like the AI that Google is developing and whatnot, they actually can develop their own language and come up with a mathematical equation or design like that, when our brains have to really think and work hard at it.
Yeah. And then one thing that hadn't been touched on was there have also been the stories about that animal life on some of these crop circles will stay away from the actual crop circle itself.
Ooh, I hadn't heard that. And I wonder if it is the electromagnetic, whatever is being used for the ones that the stalks bend. I wonder if there is something to, and nothing like it could go as far as you want in terms of like alien life, or it could be as basic as, is there something radiating from the earth, from within the earth, causing this, and the animals are hypersensitive to it, some kind of extra electromagnetic like pulse of some sort.
Yeah, because I could swear that years ago there was even a story talking about they were examining things as small as worms, that they would find worms in a field, but then when they would go into either into the actual crop circle itself or closer to the epicenter, they wouldn't find the worms that they were finding in plethora throughout the rest of the field.
You know, that just made me think of something. If it was electromagnetic pulses from underneath the earth creating these shapes, remember a while ago, it was a few years ago, they were creating music beats. They would put salt on top of speakers, and then they would play certain music beats, and it would create pictures in the salt and shapes based on the like vibration of the music. It would create like full-on shapes and pictures. And I wonder, could it be something like that? Is there some pulse within our earth we don't know about that creates like a shape on the surface level of our earth?
Well, music is just another form of math.
That was pretty.
Talking about, math being the universal language, I think music would be just another dialect of that language. So, I mean, it's very plausible that, yeah, there's probably something deep in, this harmony, maybe this core of quartz crystal that's making these vibrations, and that's what's drawing them to, or something planted by them, who knows? Or maybe this whole planet is just a universal machine, and they're coming in to direct its way through the years.
What if it's ley lines? Like, aren't these kind of happening sometimes near ley lines?
Yeah, but aren't ley lines everywhere?
At this point, yes. But I don't know. Just a thought.
If I saw crop circles popping up in hot spots of ley line areas, like the vortexes and stuff like that, I would be inclined to think, yeah, maybe it's the ley lines. But it's like we don't see a lot of crop circles reported in the U.S. on any of our hotspots, like near Arizona or near like Salt Lake City, Utah, or anything like that, like where they converge quite a bit in the mapping. Right. And so maybe it's possible some of them are attributed to ley line energy, but you think we would find more of those if that was like the driving factor of circles. I like the idea though.
Makes sense.
It's always the ley line's fault. I'm going to segue us over to Skinwalker Ranch. So Skinwalker Ranch, there were these two brothers that actually went, it's always two brothers, always up to no good. They went to, because they had researched all about it, so they actually flew out there to see what they could find about Skinwalker Ranch, and they hiked around and they took a ton of pictures outside of the ranch, kind of looking into it and trying to monitor as much as they could. And they saw so many different things that just like tested their skepticism. But one of the things one of the brothers had kind of left with after the fact was that at night when everything was quiet and they were like going to bed, he said that it almost was like the earth was humming. Like he could hear like a resonance and a constant humming from the area that they were staying in. And I'm like, oh, is that like the earth's harmonics that he's hearing? Or is there something, because that's a hotbed of just phenomenon, is there something to do with, again, like something resonating from within the earth, some kind of rhythmic pulse, some magnetic pulse that drives like this metaphysical activity that we can't explain, like crop circles or the things that they saw at the ranch.
You used to live in Utah, right?
Yeah.
So your time in Utah, and I forget which years that was, but did you? I mean, I know you weren't next to the Skinwalker Ranch, but did the Skinwalker Ranch ever come up as a subject with anyone who you ever talked to, and while you were living there?
Okay, so are you guys ready for a story?
Always ready for a story.
I was always curious because I look up like hauntings and like really weird sites in the U.S. like so I can bookmark and maybe one day go visit. And Skinwalker Ranch always popped up, and this was probably when I was in my early 20s on like the basic searches, and I would read some things here and there about it, but I didn't really look too much into the where it is. It was just like, ooh, I don't know where this ranch is, but it sounds creepy and cool, and one day I'm gonna go. Add it to the list. And I think part of why I didn't even bother to look at where it was too seriously is because everything on everybody's websites about it is that it's highly secured, highly guarded, and you cannot get close to it without people driving out to rush you away. And so it was like, all right, well, I'm not even going to attempt it because I'm just going to get thrown, out. So I'm good. But when I was driving into Utah, so when I moved there, I drove, and it was overnight because I do better driving at night. And I came from the southern route from Colorado, so going down and then up through Utah to get to Salt Lake City, because there's two routes. You can go north or south and then kind of come up into Salt Lake City. So I did the southern route, which is more like the desert, Red Canyons kind of drive. And I wanted to avoid Wyoming and potential storms and deer. So I did the southern route, and it was about 1 a.m. I had the car loaded. My dog was in the passenger seat on the floor next to it, just kind of chilling. It was getting late. And I remember I was jamming. I was having a good time. Anybody that's ever just road tripped and your music's going and you're like, yeah, I got this. I'm the drummer. I'm the guitarist. I'm the singer. I'm everything. It's great. And I remember it was dark. I couldn't see anything on either side, like formations of land, anything. It was that dark. There was just nothing out there, which stars beautiful, but nothing. And very like narrow, one lane on each side road. Remember, as I'm driving and I'm jamming out and I'm having a good time, all of a sudden it felt like someone started jabbing my chest with like cold icicles, and a sense of just dread came over me. Like just hit me all at once. And I'm like, whoa, like what is happening? And then I felt like something was trying to pull me off the road, like just pull me off. And I'm like looking to the side, like, I don't know what's over there, but I don't like this. I'm not going to follow that pull. I don't know what it is, but it really did feel like someone was literally trying to pull me. And I'm just like, nope, stay on the road, stay on the road, stay looking forward, stay on the road. And it was an awful feeling. And it lasted that way, like a really seriously strong pull, and like the icicle feelings and the dread lasted probably for about 10 minutes. And then all of a sudden, gone.
Oh, you should have followed it.
Dark road and nothing. I couldn't see anything. Like I'm just going to drive off the road. And so I was like, I don't know what the fuck that was, but that was awful. And like my dog had started whining, and it was just like, I'm going to stay on this road. Now I'm going to stay driving forward. And this is not how you want to enter into a new place that you're moving to, right? Mm-hmm. So I drove up into like an hour and a half later, 2 hours, I ended up being in Salt Lake City. And I'm like, I don't know where I was. And I knew that like I had seen a sign probably about after the 10 minutes, like when it had lifted, probably about 5 minutes after that, I saw the sign for the city price. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to remember. And so then, like, I did that trek a few times, came through the south. Same thing happened the second time. And it was nighttime, felt that same dread and prickling. And I'm like, what the fuck? So this time, like, I'm like trying to pay attention to the road markers, so that I can kind of get an idea of where geographically I am in the state, because that's really weird. That's like not a coincidence. And then sure enough, it went away and I see the sign for price and it's like, that's weird. So I stopped driving that way. I really, it freaked me out. And so I stopped driving that way and I would go the northern route. And I'm like, I'll take my chance with the deer. And I totally hit a deer one time.
He deserved it.
My 30th birthday. Yeah, look, I'm dating myself now. My 30th birthday, I actually was going to go to Moab with some friends. And they were driving. One of the people was driving. I fell asleep. You have to go south to get to Moab. I fell asleep in the car. I woke up. Like, it felt like somebody yanked me out of my sleep with like icicles and like dread. And I woke up like panicking. And I looked around. Where am I? Where am I? And this is daytime this time. And I see where I'm at daytime. And it's like after the price sign. And there's this town coming up called Wellington. It's the same exact spot. And it pulled me out of my sleep. Like, how crazy is that? So I'm like, I never want to go on this road again. On the way back, because we had to take the same way back, I actually asked them to pull over there was a gas station off the way, and I actually asked them to pull over so I could draw a pin on the map to figure out where exactly is this happening. And there was a sign for 9 Mile Canyon. So doing some research, 9 Mile Canyon actually directly leads to Skinwalker Ranch. And 9 Mile Canyon is like very heavily petroglyphs and lots of Native American just like artifacts and stuff have been found there. And it was like, ooh, that was a lot that I'm feeling. So I ended up meeting at an art gallery years later, this girl, or not years later, like a year later, this girl that's from Price. And I asked her about that because I'm like, perfect, there's Price. And for me, it was like halfway between Price and Wellington. They were very close to each other. But I asked her like, hey, this really weird thing happened to me. And I know I'm going to sound nuts, but I'm curious. Is there weird stuff that happens like in Price or like Wellington area? She's like, oh yeah, there's unexplainable car crashes all the time where people just go off the road. And she's like, and it's weird because when they're asked about like what happened, they're just like, I don't know. And I'm like, that's nuts. That is crazy. So I didn't want to follow that. Like, I've always wanted to go to Skinwalker Ranch, and I know 9 Mile Canyon, you can follow that, and it leads. It's not literally 9 miles. I think it's like a 49-mile trail, but it leads directly towards Skinwalker Ranch. It's a direct path. And I feel like there's a whole lot of history in that area. And when you research Skinwalker Ranch, they even say that it's not limited or restricted to just the ranch. It's that whole basin that weird shit happens. So, sorry, that was my story. Storytelling time with Ashley.
In April of this year, my brother and sister and I, we were driving to Idaho to go take care of, my mom's stuff. And we actually took the northern route. And we were in Utah. I think we had barely gotten in, or we were just maybe 45 minutes in or something. And then we were on one of those 2-lane highways. And all of a sudden, the GPS told us to make a U-turn out of nowhere. Like, we're going the same direction for a long time. And then all of a sudden, it's just like, make a U-turn. We looked at each other and we're like, why would we do that and go back the way we came? I don't know exactly where we were, but we were like probably 130 miles away from Skinwalker Ranch. So I don't know how far the reach goes, but it was just weird. And I know that they experience weird stuff with electronics there as well. So I don't know. But that was just weird. And it never happened again. It was just in one little spot for like maybe 10 minutes. It kept telling us to make a U-turn. And then it stopped and everything was fine.
Some of the best information on Skinwalker Ranch is some of the stuff that came out long ago. And like, since I'm 50 years old, and I can remember in the 1990s listening to radio programs like Art Bell, right, before George Norrie and all that kind of stuff. George Knapp was he's a kind of a famous, well-known guy in the UFO community and parapsychology in terms of being an investigative journalist who would cover all kinds of topics. And George Knapp was doing some really good work talking about Skinwalker Ranch as it began to first come to light in the 1990s. And, one of the things that's always talked about was that Utah has a history going back to the 1970s for a high level of UFO activity. And what's interesting about Skinwalker Ranch is it becomes one of these kind of devil triangle type locations that people talk about in the world, where it's not just UFOs, it's Bigfoots, it's possible demonology, poltergeist activity. It's literally the entire gamut of everything that you could possibly think of. And so George Knapp, the stuff that he would do and the research that he was doing, uh, talking to all of the people at the time, because I believe it's the family that had the property before they sold it to, I believe it was Robert Bigelow.
Yeah, the Shermans had it in
Yeah,
'94,
the
and then they
Shermans,
sold it
yeah.
in '96. Yeah.
Yeah, because in his book, Knapp refers to the Shermans as, I believe, the Gormans at the time to protect their identity. But, so they had that property. And then they had it for, I think it was for like until like 96 or 98 or something like that.
Yeah, it was '96.
Yeah, and then they give it to Robert Bigelow, and then Robert Bigelow brings in his scientific team. He creates NIDS, right, the National Institute for Discovery Science, and then they spend several years doing quote unquote, just research, observation, studying the property, and Robert Bigelow became interested, according to Knapp, because Bigelow came interested in the property because of the UFOs. He wasn't really aware or even interested in necessarily any of the stuff that might be quote unquote supernatural. Because that property, when you think about that, and again, it's not just like you said, Ashley, it wasn't just Skinwalker Ranch, because everything that's related to Skinwalker Ranch, the neighbors of that property have had experiences. They suffered cattle mutilations, they suffered cattle disappearing, the same kinds of strange occurrences. The town, I forget what the closest town is to there, but they have something going back to the 1950s of having all kinds of experiences from UFO sightings. It includes everything from silver discs to what they used to call the Mexican hat UFOs. And so it's all the stuff that goes back even before anyone knew what Skinwalker Ranch was, before it became a part of the popular lexicon. And this is where it's kind of conflicting for me, because I have kind of a love-hate relationship with this. Because what I was saying before was like some of the best stuff you'll find out about is stuff in the history when people were first talking about it and discovering Skinwalker Ranch, and what's happened now in contemporary times. Because, Bigelow sold the property to a conglomerate, which was then taken over by a real estate agent in Utah, who then trademarked Skinwalker Ranch. And now there's this stupid, cheesy.
TV show.
Yeah.
I actually like the TV show, but
Well, okay. Well, I'm sorry, John, but I mean, it's that show, that TV show is following the exact template and formatting of the Oak Island series, right? Which is they have a war room, they have a command thing, everything is scripted, and it's a show that will be serialized. It'll go from season to season to season to just kind of milk a subject matter, as opposed to a straightforward documentary type investigation. So anyway, my point is that when you go back and you read the stuff that actually happened on Skinwalker Ranch, like the stuff that happened to the Shermans, from everything to like they would have like the wife, she would be cooking food, and utensils in the kitchen would disappear out of the drawers, and then they would show up in places like inside the microwave or inside the refrigerator. She would be in the bathroom taking a shower, and then her comb or brush, why she had locked the door in the bathroom, when she would come out, it would be out of the room. There would be teleportation of objects. There's accounts of people like cords of wood that had been stacked for a project or something on the property. And then within 30 minutes, because they went to go get a drink of water, that cord of wood has now been moved 100 yards, right? The disappearance of 2,000-pound cattle, like instantaneously. And then that's not including the cattle mutilations, cattle that were found dead, not because they had been mutilated, because they had been dropped from a great height, you know? I mean, there's so much of the original accounts of stuff. Like one of the creepiest is that story when they were doing observations, I believe it was with NIDS, and I think it was the original property owner, not the one before the Shermans, but with the Shermans, where, again, people are going to think that we're crazy, but
We are.
they talked about portals on that property.
Yeah, I remember those stories. I never saw the portals.
Yeah, there was the account of a portal that opened up, and they described it as it looking like at first like an orange orb light. But as you looked at it, you could see that it was transparent and you could see to the other side. And on the other side, it looked like it was a different horizon. It looked like it was a different sky. And in that account, they saw a physical being elbowing or crawling their way through the tunnel from that side coming into our side. And when it stepped out and stood up, it was effectively like an 8-foot tall Bigfoot that then ran off into the darkness. Now, a person can say, oh, that's bullshit or whatnot. But if you go back to that time period when these accounts were being described, that is freaky stuff.
Yeah, there's no influence. There's no influence to them at that time.
This is where we take a moment to advise our listeners to not do drugs because Bigfoot and portals. But interestingly enough, we just actually did an episode on cryptids and Bigfoot, and it was like, where do they go? Because if there's that many sightings, where are they going? Interesting. Maybe they're portal traveling like alien beings, and that's where they go. That's where they're living, and they just pop over. So So I'd like to actually touch on something, because I will say this, I will preface this. I experienced more things that question my logic and potential sanity in Utah than I have in any other place. Like, I do feel like activity of all kinds is super high there.
There's probably an interdimensional terror there.
I'm not completely dismissive of things being a what if. But with that said, on this show, I saw a clip on the show, the Skinwalker Ranch show, and it was something along the lines of that I don't want to, like, they gloss over it, like, in the clip at least, they gloss over it quite a bit, and I think maybe it lays bearing to it, is the levels of radiation on the ranch, that there's levels of radiation that are, they spike. And I can't help but think about our episode last season where we had a guest tell us how carbon monoxide poisoning can actually cause people to hallucinate poltergeist-like activity, as well as demon possession-like activity. And so when we're talking about the Shermans and the things that she was seeing and experiencing, and the moving silverware and the disappearing brush, I can't help but wonder, in those moments where those kind of activities are occurring or they're seeing the portals, is it possible that the radiation levels were high, or there was some kind of chemical in the air that might have been causing a hallucinogenic-like reaction?
I think anything's possible.
NIDS was studying that. NIDS was doing research, and they were examining all the plant life, all the flora, any minerals that were in the grounds that would have isotopes or anything like that. They were looking for plants that would have hallucinogenic properties and stuff like that. So, a lot of people think that, Bigelow was there to do some kooky stuff, but he was a guy who is really interested in UFOs, and that NIDS group, that original group, was really just doing simple science investigation, and so they were looking for all of the practical explanations for any of these things. They weren't there to validate wild, crazy claims. So they were looking for those exact same things. And they couldn't find anything that would explain, like, her having those kinds of experiences, or her husband, or their 2 children, or any of the ranch hands who happened to work for them. And then outside of that, it wasn't just their experiences. Their neighbors were encountering the same kind of stuff. People were talking about black figures walking around in the night that had no face. They were just kind of shapes, and that they would come up to the buildings or the houses, and they would look in. They talked about beams of light that would shoot out of the ground into the sky.
You know what's interesting is those 2 brothers, I think they did this research on their own, but also for like a Freemasonry site. But one of the brothers mentioned seeing shadow figures as well, like in the fields, and same thing, like random lights, and they weren't even on the ranch because you can't get into the ranch. So there's actually a cliff that overlooks the ranch that people have figured out they can post up there and look down into the ranch. And so many people have like camped out there and visited there and experienced from a distance things going off in the ranch.
Yeah. And even in the surrounding areas, And I just wanted to add this, because I see people think that Bigelow is like some weird nefarious character or whatnot. There was a time there when they had the property that was locked off, right? And when NIDS set up shop, they did build observation towers that everyone called guard towers, but they weren't guard towers. They were observation towers, and they were connected to. They had these dog runs because they were using dogs as like biosensors. They would have animals on the property to kind of sniff or smell or detect if there was something going on. But even in something as simple as those guard towers, that's what people want to call them, but they were observation towers. Them doing their simple scientific stuff, they would have weird things happening to the dogs, happening to the equipment that they were building in. One of the things about that area is that you're not supposed to dig. You're not supposed to disturb the ground. You're not supposed to disturb the earth and stuff like that. But again, it's not just fixated on Skinwalker Ranch. It has been happening to the areas all around Skinwalker Ranch. And again, it's one of these things where it's like, that stuff is fascinating to me, especially back then when you heard about it, because when people would talk to you about like a Devil's Triangle type place, at least for me as a kid in the 70s, you would think of the Bermuda Triangle. You didn't really think of it as landlocked locations. And then years later, into the 1990s, you find out here is a land area that is acting like a typical Devil's Triangle. And it's not the only one, because there's several in the United States. But again, it's this place that has all this strange stuff happening within it. And the stuff that gets talked about today in like the newer TV programs, again, I have a hard time with. I would encourage anyone to go back and to dig up the original reporting, the original programs that were talking about it, because when you listen to that stuff, it is some of the most eerie, frightening, freaky stuff that you'll ever hear. And it's not being told to you in some bombastic bullshit way. It's being recounted as like someone who's like, you know what, it happened and I didn't like it and I got the fuck out.
Yeah, and fun fact for you, John, Skinwalker Ranch actually sits directly on a ley line. So,
ley lines.
Ley lines. I'm not saying it's the ley lines, but it's the ley lines.
There it is, ley lines.
I think John should drive out there. You should drive out there, walk up to the gate with dowsing rods, and just say ley lines.
You had to say it 3 times, though.
I would do that. I would definitely do that for the podcast and just for the hell of it.
These topics for someone like me, because I'm 50 years old, and since I grew up with a lot of this stuff in terms of like, being a child of the 70s, that's when like everything began to hit about all this kind of stuff, from Bigfoot to UFOs to supernatural to ghosts, you name it. So for me, Skinwalker Ranch, it didn't pop up for me until the 1990s, right? So, but going back in time, what I talked about earlier was Utah, because you lived in Utah, and you had said so yourself that you feel like Utah is a place that you've had the most strangest experiences.
Yeah.
So Utah, even before everything was Skinwalker Ranch, Utah has a history of UFO sightings. It has its own unique history of just paranormal stuff. We didn't even touch on some of the stuff that came up in the history of it. But, there's what's his name? There was a Spanish missionary in 1776 who was doing a land crossing of the United States. I think it's like Father Escalante. And he has a journal. And in his journal from 1776, he describes seeing phenomenon that would basically be UFOs. And that took place in the Utah area of Utah, right? And of course, there's the Indian tribe as well. So there was already a history before, contemporary United States history of things happening in that area of the land. And of course, the Utah tribe, their whole thing about what a skinwalker is, right? I mean, this is where it gets kind of heated with some people, because they've never said that a skinwalker is an alien being. To them, a skinwalker is a dark spirit, right? It's a dark spirit that takes souls, that takes life, and that it's also a shapeshifter and that it can change. And it's when you get into the contemporary stuff that people talk about a skinwalker being identified with like alien beings or UFOs and stuff like that. And And then, people had talked about, and the Shermans had experiences with a large-sized wolf on their property. And, the encounter of that, again, I don't want to ruin things for people. I want them to go and discover this stuff. But when they tried to identify the kind of wolf that they saw on the property, they were given images of what kind of wildlife that they could most accurately describe it as. They picked a dire wolf, which is basically a prehistoric wolf that hasn't existed in over 10,000 years. So, there is all this weird stuff that if you really take the time to go and like read it or listen to it or watch it, I mean, it's amazing stuff. And even if you're not watching it with the trappings of like the current day TV show, right? And I hate to bag on it, but the actual stuff that like you said, like if you were listening to it in the middle of the night, you would never fucking drive anywhere near Skinwalker Ranch. Utah has its own history with the paranormal, has its own history of UFOs. There was a guy who wrote a book in the 1970s about a rash of UFO sightings that were taking place in Utah. And all of that was within the Utah Basin, which is that region of the Skinwalker Ranch. And then by the time when, it's the 1990s, and I'm listening to a radio program, Art Bell, all of a sudden Art Bell is talking to a guy like George Knapp. And I think he was talking to one of Bigelow's scientists who had hired a guy, I think his name was Colm Kellerman. And I think Colm Kellerman and George Knapp, they wrote that book together talking about Skinwalker Ranch. So in the 1990s, that's when Skinwalker Ranch began to first pop up. And that's when I discovered it. And I think they've talked about before that there had been periods of like where there's a high level of activity and then there's low level of activity. And then there'll be an increase in activity again. That location, I have not had the privilege or the pleasure of being able to go to, but I'm fascinated by it and I love the idea of it. And again, for all the stuff that's described, it's just batshit crazy. And I can understand where people would be like, this is just fucking bullshit. But I mean, seriously, just go read, go listen, go watch this stuff. I mean, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I think that the thing that is really, I think, drew my attention way back in the day and is super just fascinating to me is the fact that it's not just one type of thing. Yeah. It's portals, it's supernatural activity, it's, mutilated cows with no explanation of what's going on. And it is the level of government conspiracy that gets sprinkled into it. Now, whether that's used to perpetuate something or not, I don't know. But I know back when I researched it, this was a long time ago, people would talk about how like the second you started to approach these gates, like a black truck or, government type vehicle would just speed up and like wave people off. And the level of security and surveillance around the perimeters that was there to keep people away, even back then, was pretty vast. And so that in and of itself, and then you have the TV show now where they, the guys, whether they're making it up for TV or not, they talk about, the Bigelow owner, he did work with the government, and they did, I think they called it like a black budget Pentagon research on Skinwalker Ranch.
He does have 2 satellites in outer space.
So it's like if the government's investing, if we take that as truth, and the government's investing that much into this location and this site, there's got to be something there, right? Even if it's curiosity, like why are all of these people reporting these things? What is going on? Because I think the thing that had stuck out to me originally when I was looking up Skinwalker Ranch and researching it a long, long time ago, it was actually the portals. I don't know why, but that caught my attention more than anything else, that people would mention portals, like wormholes. They would mention wormholes, or what they would deem as like, hey, if I had to say this is what I saw, it looked like a wormhole, would just like manifest at night on different parts of the property. And they could be there for a little while and then it would go away. And it's just like, what? What are you seeing? What? And people, who aren't associated with the ranch, supposedly, who aren't working with the ranch or own the ranch, people that are, crouched over the cliff looking over, seeing similar things. They're describing like, yeah, I saw this thing that kind of looked like it appeared out of nowhere in the air, and it looked like a tunnel of some sort, and I don't know what I saw. And again, it's like, what are they seeing? And is it some kind of hallucinogenic in the air, or is it something else? What is it?
Only one way to find out. Let's go.
We're going.
There's so many random things that happen on different levels. There's like orbs of light that travel. Because we talked earlier about like fairies, like a fairy light traveling around. And then they're like full on, the same tribe members have seen metallic spacecraft. That's not something ethereal. That's not something supernatural. That looks like actual physical technology, right? They've seen different kinds of orbs or lights in the sky that look like what you're talking about, like it's a portal opening up in the sky or a portal opening up in the ground. Then there's the shafts of light that come out of the ground and emanate into the sky. There was an account of I guess the only way I could describe it is like a flowering, like a flower opening up of light that happened in that location. So it's like, typically, when people talk about like, oh, well, the place is haunted, and it's like, well, what do you see? It's like, oh, I see a white lady. White lady always walks down. But this is a location where people are talking about Bigfoots, black figures with no faces, wolves that are the size of prehistoric animals that then disappear and leave no tracks, lights that come in all sizes and shapes, physical metallic ships that appear and disappear out of nowhere. I mean, it's so much.
It's batshit crazy. So what is it? What do you guys think it is about this area? Because like you said, it's not just the ranch, it's that basin. So what is it about this specific area that is manifesting so much activity? Like, let's just suspend disbelief for a moment and say it's all real. There's wormholes, there's dinosaurs, there's Bigfoot, like it is all real. Okay, what is it about this specific region of the US and the world that is manifesting this level of activity? Because it can't be one ley line. Like it can't be. So what do we think it is?
I don't know. All the Native American energy that surrounds it, maybe? I don't know. I mean, they're definitely big believers in all of that stuff. Yeah, just maybe. I don't know. Especially in that area.
The theme that I would go back to if I was going to play that game with myself is no, I don't mean it in any kind of bad way, but it's like, if I'm trying to rationalize what is going on, right? If I can't find something that's just, simple explanation for it, the thing that tends to make sense to me is, and it's not just for this location, because people have talked about the same kind of thing the world over, but that historically there are locations on the planet of the Earth that were visitation points for entities or beings from another world or another dimension, and that these locations on our planet were the places that they always came to, that they always traveled through or landed at, however you want to describe it. And so these particular locations, even though we advanced, we grew up, we moved on, we forgot all kinds of stuff, the locations are still interaction points. They're still visitation points. So if it's like a stoplight for a ship coming from outer space or a ship or beings coming from another dimension, it is the stop point. It's the crosswalk where they come here, they come to our planet, or they come to our dimension, they come to our time, however you want to describe it. That's the only thing that really makes sense to me, is that it's the kind of place where the laws of physics, the laws of science as we understand them, seem to kind of like stop working in a certain way.
So it's like our interdimensional airport?
Yeah. I mean, obviously I'm not saying it's like it's a bus hub where people are waiting to catch their next flight. But the concept of like when you talk about a wormhole, about like, okay, where does it interconnect, right? And if you were to interconnect with a planet, are you interconnecting beneath the planet's surface? Are you interconnecting subterranean? Because that's another thing people have talked about. They've said that they've heard the sounds of machinery coming from beneath the ground. They've heard the sounds of voices talking in different languages, mocking them coming from the ground. So, the only thing that makes sense to me is that if it's something that's interdimensional, or and I say interdimensional because of the aspect of portals, the aspect of things disappearing and vanishing. If it was just a straight up UFO experience where you were just seeing objects coming out of the sky and coming to the property, then I would purely be like, oh, it's a visitation point coming from outside of the planet, coming from space. But because so much of it seems to be happening from within, and again, this could be a point on the planet that goes back millions of years, right? So then even before us, when the tribes, the indigenous people lived in this country and they were flourishing, they would have inhabited these lands, and they just so would have happened to have grown up and started living in a location that already had a pre-existing history to it, just like it's a pre-existing history to us. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think we kind of discussed that in the ley lines episode a bit, like where societies kind of sprout up and expand tend to be in areas where there are like vortexes nearby. So maybe, the Native Americans in the area were drawn to that energy, that hot spot, if you will, of whatever activity is going, whatever is also causing this activity. They were drawn to that, and that kind of same concept where like we're sensitive to things we maybe don't understand, we gravitate to that, and then that kind of flourishes. Because Salt Lake City is like, if you look at the ley line maps, if that's a real thing, like it all, like so many of them converge in Salt Lake City, which happens to be also a very major town within Utah, right? And everything just kind of expands from there. So maybe, they were drawn because Native Americans, at least as we know it, tend to be a little bit more spiritual and in tune with that energetic aspect of themselves. So followed that kind of energetic call and set up base around that area. With that said, though, one of my theories, because it could be so many things, we're just playing the what if game. But I just wonder, because like you said, people have reported the sound of machinery underground and things going on. What if it's like Roswell, where there is some kind of hidden base underneath where things are being tested, experimented on, and that's where we get the manifestation of wormholes and odd things happening with like magnetic situations, and cows drop in from the sky, like high levels of radiation. Like maybe there's testing underneath the surface that we're not aware of, or experimentation that is causing these things, and that's why there's so many different types of activities occurring.
Well, that starts to sound to me like the Dulce base that has been described before. Is it a man-made base that was built to be in cooperation with alien beings, or is it a base that was actually created by alien beings going way, way, way back? Again, you're right. This game, it's like that's certainly a possibility. Going back 50 years, they had, and I'm pretty sure they still do, they have a high Mormon population, right? So you have people of a religious bent of mind, right, who you might think would be closed off to experiences, yet they've reported that they've had strange experiences as well. But if I try to pick things off of like, well, what's going on, what's the possibility, outside of just saying straight up, everybody's lying, everybody's full of shit, it's all fucking crap, none of it ever happened. And I can't say that because, again, my point from the beginning of this was that the thing about Skinwalker Ranch is that it goes beyond Skinwalker Ranch. You've got experiences from people outside of Skinwalker Ranch. So, so it's impossible for me to disregard everyone's experience. I could be a dick and be like, oh, well, Bigelow and the Shermans and all these people, they just wanted to make money off the property. They wanted notoriety, blah, 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 blah. Same thing with Amityville, right? The same kinds of arguments that you've heard time and time again. But I can't do that because there's so much that goes back 50 years, goes back 100 years, goes back to 1776, goes back before that. You know what I mean? So the explanations I'm left with, it's either something purely spiritual, something on a supernatural level that is capable of just encompassing everything, or that it is something that is science-wise beyond what we know and understand right now. And that's really all that I'm left with.
I love it. I love these conversations with you, David. What about you, John? Any thoughts?
No, my mind is just blown by all the different things that, you said, that David said. All of it makes sense, and then, it doesn't make sense at the same time. So I just, mind blown.
Yeah, I'm sure someone's going to listen to the things that I've said and think that I'm crazy and wacko. But you know, but again, it's like, and I think that's why I have an advantage being as old as I am, is because I grew up in a time where this stuff was shunned, right? If you believed in Bigfoot, if you believed in UFOs, if you believed in ghosts, okay, it was frowned upon. Pilots, like I talked about before, were in fear of being thrown out of the Air Force or being thrown out of working for an airline for reporting seeing an object in the sky. It's only in the contemporary time that now it's become trendy and fashionable to be able to say, oh, yeah, let's talk about this. It's cool to talk about this. But if you were growing up in that time, to discover this stuff and to hear about it and to have people recount their experiences knowing that they were putting themselves on the line to just even talk about it, it carries so much weight that's really hard to describe if you're trying to look at this stuff through the prism of today.
Yeah, I think definitely modern pop culture and media in general has helped sensationalized it in a way where it is acceptable. But I think it's also sensationalized it a little too much where it's not taken seriously in the aspect of science. And so it's a bitter, it's a double-edged sword because it's accepted, but it's almost accepted too much to the point where people don't want to put the effort into actually putting true research behind it that we're aware of. Now, there may be research and things we don't understand that our governments keep from us for sake of, like we've discussed before, reducing panic and all the other things. But as far as we know, there's not active research out there to discover what's going on Skinwalker Ranch. Why are these manifesting in a way that is transparent to the public? I have a joke for you guys. What currency do aliens use?
I don't know.
No idea.
Starbucks.
Yeah. I don't know where I was going with that, but it was definitely not that. So there you go.
Got a joke for you.
Okay.
What did the goldfish say to the other goldfish?
I don't know.
There must be a God who changes the water.
That's cute. That's pretty much how that sums up humans on Earth. That's funny.
Now you're thrown off.
You know me. I love my silly jokes. What is an alien's favorite beverage? This is your last one. So, last groan-worthy joke. What is an alien's favorite beverage?
No idea.
Tab?
Gravity. I love that both of you shake your heads at me. This is just great.
Somewhere in the world, there is a child laughing very, very hard right now.
I hope there's not a child listening to these episodes.
I was going to say, actually, that would kind of make me question the parents on that one, but...
On letting them listen to this. Oh, man. I know. I have friends who ask, like, oh, what's your show? I'll listen to it. I'm like, don't let your kids listen to this. And they're like, what? And I'm like, do not allow your children to listen to this. This is not a kid's show. Well, this has been a really awesome episode. Any last thoughts on crop circles or Skinwalker Ranch, my awesome friends?
It's been a brilliant conversation. I learned a lot tonight, and I'll be honest with you, I really haven't, I didn't know a whole lot about Skinwalker Ranch until this conversation. So I appreciate the knowledge and the theories and everything that was spread tonight. So it was very enlightening.
I just got to say that when David was describing the portal and the thing elbowing its way out of there, it just gave me fucking chills and creeped me out. And I love it. And that was fantastic.
Keep that image in your mind when you go to bed tonight.
No, not if I could help it.
Any last thoughts, David Gunn?
Yeah, I would just say that there is tremendous merit to going back and looking up the old information, the old investigations, what doesn't matter what media it is, if it was radio, if it was TV or whatnot, because some of that stuff will be some of the scariest, creepiest stuff that you'll come across, really, because it's unfiltered by today's entertainment standards, right? It was just straightforward here's an account, and it's an account unlike anything that you've ever heard before. So I would just encourage people, there's a lot to digest, there's a lot to find out about, and pursue it. And other than that, I would just say that I thank you guys tremendously for having me on again, and thank you, John, thank you, Ashley, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
A huge thank you again to David. He was absolutely fantastic, always is. And Shane as well. Thank you very much. To all of our listeners, thanks for tuning into 3Haunted Podcast with your host. I'm John Thomas.
I am Ashley Lunar Goddess.
And as always, if you have any comments, questions, or episode suggestions, please email us at 3hauntedpodcast@gmail.com. If you haven't done so already, please sure to like, follow, and subscribe to our social medias. You don't want to miss one crazy moment.
As the night hour continues, it gets a little spookier.